Have you ever believed Bigfoot was just a myth? What if I told you, in 1996, deep in the mountains of Georgia, a 66-year-old war nurse, grieving the loss of her husband and son, came face to face with a creature taller than any man, and saved its life. During a raging storm, Margaret Holloway stepped out into the darkness and found a massive, injured Bigfoot. Its leg broken, bleeding. Instead of running, she knelt beside it, cleaned the wound, stitched it, and whispered stories of her sorrow into the rain. But here's the truth no one told you. That Bigfoot wasn't alone. And what happened that night, between a grieving woman and a clan of giants, formed a silent pact that would forever bind her to the forest. This story comes straight from Margaret's journals and the last visit of a deputy who nearly saw too much. Watch till the end to uncover why Bigfoot has never attacked humans, what gift they left Margaret, and how a woman, once lost in guilt, became the silent guardian of Skeena Gap. If you skip this, you'll miss one of the most hauntingly beautiful truths ever kept hidden in the woods. The fog moved like a breath held too long. Just after dawn, it poured over the ridges of the Chattahoochee National Forest like it had nowhere else to be, settling low into Skeena Gap like a ghost returning home. Red and gold leaves clung to the branches above the valley, but many had already fallen, scattered across the mossy earth and clumped around the wooden steps of the cabin perched on the slope. The house, small and weather-worn, sat tucked between two towering sweet gums, its roof sagging just enough to show its age, but still strong. Inside, the kettle hummed softly. The scent of roasted chicory and faded cedar wood clung to the air like memory. Margaret Holloway stood at the sink, back hunched just slightly, her fingers working with steady care as she rinsed a handful of wild mint. The water ran clear over the leaves, slipping through the gaps in her fingers. She moved slowly now, not out of frailty, but out of reverence for the silence. She laid the mint across the old linen cloth by the window, where morning light filtered through the fog. The steam from the kettle curled up like ghost fingers toward the rafters. Outside, the porch creaked with its usual ache when she stepped out onto it. Her boots, cracked and dark with years of Georgia soil, thudded softly on the boards. She wrapped the old quilt shawl tighter around her shoulders, lifted the enamel mug to her lips, and stared out at the forest. Across the valley, the trees lit up in amber and rust, the kind of fire only October knew how to build. The Bible lay open beside her chair. Not to a particular verse, not anymore. Its spine broken in 3 places, edges worn thin from years of hands searching for comfort. The page this morning had turned itself to Psalm 91, but Margaret wasn't reading. Not really. Her eyes stayed on the tree line, and her thoughts wandered the way old thoughts do, like deer through tall grass, silent, constant. She had once saved lives with those hands, steady, blood-stained, precise. Vietnam. She didn't talk about it. Not because it was unbearable, but because no one really wanted to hear the way bodies looked when they stopped breathing for good. And maybe, deep down, she still believed some part of those screams had followed her home, tucked inside her bones like shrapnel no surgeon could remove. The mint would be dry in 3 days if the weather stayed clear. The sweet grass would take longer, already hanging from the eaves in braided loops like silent prayers. She used to make bundles for the church, but after her husband died in '94, she stopped going. People had stopped asking long before that. Some whispered she was strange, others just called her the Mountain Widow. Margaret didn't mind. She preferred the company of trees. She traced the rim of the mug with her thumb, her gaze fixed on the slope below where the trail forked into deer paths and logging scars. Somewhere down that ridge, 7 years ago, her son had died in a landslide that came without warning. A patch of rain-slick rock gave out, and the road, a road she'd signed off on during a health inspection in '87, collapsed into itself, swallowing the young forestry crew. He was 27. His name was Michael. Some nights, She dreamed the same dream, his hand, muddy and reaching, just out of her grasp. In the dream, she never reaches him. The hand disappears before she can kneel. That kind of pain doesn't heal. It burrows. Quietly, she rose from her chair and stepped back inside, where the light was dimmer, gentler. The framed photo sat on the mantel, half-shadowed. Michael in uniform, grin slightly crooked, holding the hunting dog they raised from a pup. She stood before it for a long moment, one hand lifting, trembling slightly as she touched the glass. Outside, the wind shifted. It was just past midnight the first time she heard it. A sound that didn't belong to wind or wildlife. Not the rustle of deer or the cry of a fox. This was heavier, more deliberate. A crack, sharp and wet. The snap of something thick giving way. Then a second sound, slow and low. Not a growl. Not quite. More like breath. Deep, dragging. She had blown out the lantern then, her back against the wall near the window. Heart thudding, she stayed still as the house settled into itself. For 15 minutes, nothing. Then, a rustle. Heavy steps through wet leaves. 3 of them. And then silence, as though the forest had stopped breathing. A week passed before it returned. That time, there was moonlight. Silver cut across the valley like a blade. And there, near the edge of the clearing where her property ended and the forest began, something stood, tall, broad, still. No animal she knew. Not bear, not man. It didn't move, didn't growl or charge. It only stood, half hidden in the shadows, its form unmistakably upright. The slope of its shoulders caught the light, and then, just as her breath caught, it turned and vanished. She didn't tell anyone. What could she say? That something watched her from the woods? That she saw it only when the world turned quiet enough to notice? Days slipped by. She kept to her routine. The mint was dry now. She bundled it into jars, labeling them in her careful handwriting. The sweetgrass had faded to a sunlit beige, smelling of warm bread and dry hay. She hung a fresh braid by the window. The weather held. Frost nipped at the corners of the field, but hadn't reached the cabin yet. The silence deepened. Margaret moved slower, not from age, but from some invisible gravity pulling her toward memory. Each night she'd sit with the old photograph. Sometimes she spoke aloud. Other times she just sat, watching the candlelight dance across the glass. A few nights later, when the forest was dead quiet again, the sound returned. But this time it was different. Softer. 3 knocks. Not woodpecker, not wind. Knuckles on tree bark, measured. She stayed still, listening. Then a pause, and again, 3 knocks. She didn't light the lantern this time. She didn't speak. She only sat by the window, hands resting on the edge of the quilt, waiting for something she could not name. The next morning, the air held a sharpness that hadn't been there before. A kind of tension, like the world was leaning in, waiting. She stepped outside with her coffee, and for the first time, the deer didn't scatter. A doe and her fawn stood near the edge of the yard, ears forward, watching her. The Bible had turned itself to Isaiah 35. The wilderness and the solitary place shall be glad for them. She closed it gently. That evening, she took down her old field kit from the pantry. Dusty. Smelled of camphor and old leather. She checked the bandages, ointments, the vial of comfrey oil she'd steeped last spring. The scissors still sharp. The needles still wrapped. It was almost as if she knew. She moved slower now, but with purpose. Not just routine, preparation. She didn't know what she was getting ready for, only that something was shifting. The forest watched her, and for the first time in years, Margaret Holloway no longer felt truly alone. Not in the way she used to. Not in the way that a woman who's buried a son and a husband and an entire chapter of herself usually does. No, this was different. This was the feeling of something just beyond the tree line. Something waiting. Something that remembered her. And the wind, when it passed through the eaves that night, sounded almost like a breath held too long, being released. And then, just barely, just once more, 3 knocks. The storm didn't roll in like most do in the mountains. It dropped, sudden and full-bodied, like a shout in a funeral parlor. 1 minute, the light had a copper cast to it, thick and unnatural, and the next, the sky cracked open, dumping sheets of water over the trees like some forgotten punishment. The kind of rain that made the forest hiss, that rattled window panes and stirred up every old grief tucked inside the floorboards of that little cabin on the ridge. The wind howled, not in gusts, but in solid walls that slapped the house sideways and made the porch roof groan. Leaves, branches, needles flew sideways across the yard, caught in spirals of wind that stripped the trees faster than October ever could. Thunder didn't come in rumbles. It came in sharp, cracking bursts, like bones splitting under weight. And underneath it all, the steady beat of the rain, so hard and so fast, it sounded like nails falling from the sky. Margaret sat on the edge of her bed, fully clothed, boots laced, jacket beside her. The oil lantern beside the door swayed slightly on its hook with every groan of the wind. She hadn't lit it yet. She was listening. The storm had blown out the quiet. Every bird, every squirrel, even the insects seemed to have gone mute. Only the storm had a voice now, and it shouted through every crevice of the mountainside. But she could hear something else. She wasn't sure at first. The kind of sound that hides in the folds of others. A shift, a break, a thud. Heavy, too heavy, like something had fallen. Not a tree, something dense, close. Then it came again. A second sound, low, wet, a groan. Not human, not quite animal either. It vibrated up through the floor, sank into her ribs like a warning. She stayed still, blinked, slow, then reached for the lantern. Her hand trembled only a little as she lit the wick, shielding the flame with her palm. The glow came low and warm, cutting through the wet gloom like a whisper. She pulled on the old raincoat that still smelled faintly of pine tar and stepped toward the door. The screen banged against the wall when she opened it, wind jerking it like an angry hand. She held the lantern high, the rain spearing sideways into the light. Her eyes narrowed against it. Somewhere beyond the barn. That's where the sound had come from. She knew it. She stepped into the rain. The wind hit her full on, plastering her skirt to her legs and driving cold water down her back before she made it off the porch. She moved slow, deliberate, every step pressing deep into the slick mud that had swallowed her garden path. The lantern light bounced wildly, catching only flashes. Gleaming bark, the silver shimmer of puddles, the black sway of tree limbs slashing at the wind. The sound came again, closer now. More of a moan this time, drawn out, painful. Her boots squelched through the grass as she made her way past the edge of the yard, toward the old livestock pen at the tree line. It had stood empty for years, just a few leaning posts, rusted hinges, and the sagging skeleton of a tin-roofed shelter. Nothing lived in there now, hadn't for decades. But something was inside it tonight. She reached the edge of the pen and stopped. The wind died for one full second, as if the forest were holding its breath. In that silence, the moan came again, full-throated and broken. She stepped inside the shelter. The lantern shook in her grip. The light caught movement, and her breath stopped. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything she'd seen before, not in the woods, not in any book, not even in the fragments of whispered tales from mountain boys too drunk to know better. It was slumped against the back wall, its form half hidden in shadow. But the parts the lantern touched didn't make sense. Too tall, too thick. A mat of soaked black fur clung to its massive limbs, matted and gleaming. One leg was twisted under the other, bent at a wrong angle, the thigh split open like torn hide, exposing meat and dark blood that smelled metallic and real. Its breath came in short, rough bursts. It tried to move but slumped again, its arm dragging across the floor with a sound like wet rope. She didn't run. She didn't scream. She knelt. Some part of her, the part that had held men's organs in her hands 40 years ago, the part that stitched torn arteries under canvas tents in Asia, rose up like a reflex. That part moved her now. She set the lantern down and pulled the raincoat tighter, ignoring the water cascading from her hood, the mud soaking her knees. Her eyes locked on its chest. It rose. It fell. Still breathing. The creature turned its head toward her. She froze. Its eyes met hers. Not red, not glowing, just dark, wide. There was pain in them. She didn't speak. She reached forward slowly, careful to keep her movements open, non-threatening. She was used to this. Panicked eyes, bleeding limbs, bodies in shock. She opened the coat, reached into her inner pocket, and pulled out a roll of gauze she always carried. Habit from another life. The creature didn't move. Rain hammered the roof above them. Lightning flashed. In that white burst of light, she saw the full shape of it. Massive shoulders, long arms, hands like shovels. One side of its face was smeared with blood and mud, its fur clinging in thick ropes to its body. She whispered. Not words, just sounds. Soothing noises, low and rhythmic. Her hands worked fast. She tore off strips of gauze, pressing them against the thigh wound. Blood soaked through instantly. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small jar. Comfrey and yarrow salve, thick and pungent. She smeared it across the worst of the tear, the smell mixing with blood and storm. The creature flinched. A growl started low in its chest, but didn't rise. She paused, waited, then it relaxed. Let her continue. She braced the leg, fished out 2 pieces of hickory she'd used once for her husband's broken ankle. She hadn't touched them since he died. She didn't think she'd ever need them again. She fitted them gently against the leg and wrapped the gauze tight. The creature groaned again, its head resting now against the wooden wall, breath shallow but steady. That's when she saw them. Eyes, in the tree line. Not one, not 2, many, dozens. Reflections of her lantern in silent, watching pairs. She didn't move. Then, just beyond the pen, a larger form emerged, even taller, broader. Its fur silver-streaked, thick with rain. It stood still as stone for a moment. Then it knelt. One enormous hand reached out and pressed flat against the earth. A gesture, not aggressive. Something else. Stillness spread through the trees. The eyes did not blink, and Margaret, breath caught in her throat, looked back down at the creature before her. It had closed its eyes. Its breathing had slowed. The hand from the forest stayed on the ground. A vow, perhaps. A warning. A ritual. She didn't know. But she understood enough to know this wasn't the end. This wasn't just a moment. It was the start of something that couldn't be undone. The forest had opened a door tonight, and she'd stepped through. The storm raged on above them, but it couldn't touch what had just passed between her and the thing lying in the straw. Something old, something wordless, something binding. The rain blurred the lantern light into a trembling halo, and in the hush between thunder, Margaret Holloway listened to the breath of the forest and realized she was not afraid. Not anymore. The storm had calmed by morning, but the world it left behind hadn't quite settled. Mist clung low to the earth like something ashamed of what the night had brought. Rainwater still dripped from the tin roof, slow and rhythmic, like a metronome keeping time with a heartbeat too tired to race anymore. The woods were silent, not the kind of silence that came with peace, but the strained kind, like a breath being held just out of reach. Inside the small cabin, Margaret moved with purpose. No panic. No hesitation, just a quiet intensity in every step, every motion, like a current pulling her forward. Her old first aid bag lay open on the table beside the hearth, its leather sides cracked, the brass buckles dulled from age. She reached inside with hands that remembered. Clean cloth, scissors, jars of herbs carefully labeled and wax-sealed from last season's gathering. Comfrey, yarrow, witch hazel. She packed them without second-guessing. Out back, the clothesline had snapped in the wind, and strips of linen she'd meant to dye with pokeberry were soaked and clinging to the mud. She stepped over them without pause, lantern swinging from her hand. The trail was soft and spongy beneath her boots. The shelter stood where she left it, hunched under the trees like it had bowed its head to the storm. The air inside was thick with the scent of wet straw, blood, and something else. Earthy and raw, not unpleasant, but primal. The creature was still there. It hadn't moved much, just shifted slightly in the straw. Its body curled in a way that tried to protect the damaged leg, but even that motion had disturbed the wound. Dried blood darkened the fur from hip to shin, and Margaret could already see the swelling. She set the lantern down again. The flame flickered low, casting soft shadows across the beams overhead. She knelt beside it. The creature's eyes fluttered open. For a moment, they stared at one another again, quiet, cautious. She didn't speak. Words had no place here. She simply nodded once, then reached forward, tearing a strip of muslin into cleaner lengths. The wound would have to be flushed. She knew that. Infection moved fast in flesh that thick, and if it reached the bone, she'd seen too many young men lose limbs in the jungle to misjudge it. She dipped a rag in warm water from the tin basin she'd brought. Steam curled upward. Slowly, carefully, she pressed it to the wound. The creature tensed, every muscle in its frame tightening like a drawn bow. She didn't flinch. Its breath quickened. A rumble started in its chest. Not hostile, not warning, just pain, pressed against silence. She whispered again. Not words, just the same soft hum she used with dying animals, with her husband's trembling hands in those last few nights before the morphine dulled everything. She cleaned the wound, dabbed away the dried blood, applied salve in slow, deliberate motions. The comfrey was thick and green, its scent bitter, sharp, alive. She pressed it deep into the torn flesh. When she reached for the needle and thread, the creature shifted again. A long arm pulled toward its chest, fingers twitching in half-formed reflexes. She paused, its eyes locked on her hand. She showed it the curved needle, threaded already, steady fingers. Then she held up her own arm and mimed a stitch, pressed the tip gently into her own sleeve, then pulled it through. Demonstration, ritual, consent. The creature stilled. So she began. Her hands worked with brutal tenderness. Each pass of the needle through thick hide met resistance, but she didn't falter. 12 stitches, then 2 more. She worked until the wound was closed as best it could be. By the time she finished, her arms were slick with blood, sweat, and rainwater. Her breath came heavy. She pressed a final wrap of gauze over the leg, tying it tight with a slip knot she could undo later. She sat back on her heels, exhaling. The creature blinked slowly. Then, without moving its body, it shifted its gaze toward the edge of the shelter. Margaret followed its eyes. At first, she saw nothing, just trees, dark shapes, mist curling between trunks. Then, light caught something. Eyes. Small glints, still, watching. She counted 4, then 7, then more, dozens perhaps. A ring of presence. She didn't move. The air grew heavy, not threatening, not charged with fear, but thick with attention. Something moved at the edge of the trees. Another figure stepped forward, taller than the first, bulkier. Its fur glistened with rain. It moved without sound, each step impossibly light for something so massive. It stopped 10 yards from the shelter. Then it did something strange. It knelt, one knee to the ground, and placed its hand, enormous, calloused, almost human, flat against the earth. A gesture. Margaret stared. The other eyes did not move. The creature beside her breathed slow and deep. Its fingers twitched once, then stilled. And then quiet, real quiet. Not the kind where things are waiting to happen, but the kind that happens when something old passes between beings. Something unspoken but understood. Margaret felt her own hand drift to the floor. She didn't know why. She didn't question it. She mirrored the motion, pressed her palm to the ground. The creature outside rose, watched her for a long moment, then turned, melted back into the trees. The eyes vanished with it, all except for two, smaller, closer, a younger one. Margaret could feel it, not because of its size, but because of the way it moved, hesitant, unsure. It stepped into the shelter's edge, holding something in its hands, something wrapped in leaves. It approached, slowly. Margaret didn't reach for it. She only waited. The figure knelt, placed the bundle near her feet, then stood again. In the faint light, she saw what it was. A braid, sweetgrass, woven tight, still green, as if made just hours ago. Beside it, two feathers, long, striped, turkey, and a small fragment of hickory bark, smooth and hollowed, curled slightly at the ends. She looked up. The young figure was gone. Only the breath of the forest remained, and the silence that came when two worlds brushed fingertips in the dark. The creature in the straw shifted. Its eyes opened again. She moved to it gently, pressed a palm to its forehead, still burning with fever, but it was alive. And for now, that was enough. She didn't know what this was. She didn't know what it meant, but she knew she had crossed a line, and whatever lived beyond it wasn't fantasy anymore. It bled. It breathed. It gave offerings. And it watched. The lantern flame sputtered low, casting long shadows that swayed across the walls like they had lives of their own. Margaret didn't speak. She only leaned back against the shelter wall, closed her eyes for a moment, and listened. To the breath of the creature, to the hush of the trees, to the beating in her chest that somehow felt steadier now, even as something in the woods shifted once more, as if the forest was waiting again, watching not just with eyes, but with memory, with understanding. And whatever came next, she would no longer meet it as a stranger. Not anymore. The rain had eased to a whisper, just a soft pattering against the tin like fingers drumming on an old hymn book. The kind you keep not because you sing anymore, but because the pages remember when you used to. Margaret didn't light the lantern that night. The last of the dusk had faded, and the world outside the shelter was black as pitch. But inside, the embers of the old stove glowed just enough to catch the edges of the straw, the curve of her knees, the slow rising of the creature's chest. She sat with her back against the wall, the mended blanket pulled halfway around her shoulders, the other half draped across the slumped body just feet from her. The wound hadn't bled again. That was something. But its breathing had taken on a rasp, like wind fighting through the pine boughs after too many years of being left alone. She hadn't spoken much earlier, just the sounds she remembered from the tents, from nights spent crouched beside boys who wouldn't live to see 20, hands shaking, blood everywhere, too much to hold. But now, as the night deepened and the silence of the forest felt heavier than the walls, something inside her stirred. Not from fear, from something else. She looked over at the shape in the straw and then down at her own hands. They were still stained red in the creases. Her voice was low when it came, roughened by time and wind and silence. "I signed the medical release," she said. It wasn't clear if she was talking to the creature or the ghosts in the room. Back in '87, Forestry Division needed it for the new slope. Said it'd be safe, that they'd reinforce the grade. My Michael, he told me it didn't feel right, that the rain was shifting the soil. He was 27. I told him not to worry. The breathing beside her stayed steady, but the creature's eyes were open now, watching, not blinking. She didn't look at it, just stared into the dim glow of the coals. When it came down, they said it took the machines first, then the men, trees like matchsticks. I saw the footage after. They couldn't even recover him whole. I went out there a week later. I found the cap I knit him for winter. It still had blood on it. Her voice didn't tremble. Not anymore. I didn't go to the funeral. There wasn't enough to bury. She let the words hang there, like smoke that couldn't find a way out. Outside, the forest had quieted in a way that didn't feel natural. No owls, no night insects. just a pressure, a presence, like the trees themselves were listening. "I used to think that silence was punishment," she said, "that God had decided I'd failed one too many people." The creature blinked once, slowly. Then a sound began. Margaret straightened just a little. It started low, almost imperceptible. A hum, not human, not language, but it carried. Like it came not from a throat, but from deep inside the rib cage, vibrating out through bone and fur. The creature was humming. The sound was low and mournful, like wind caught in hollow trees. It wasn't melody, not in the way people understood it, but it resonated. It reached into the walls, into her chest, and then the same sound echoed back, not from the creature, from outside, from the woods. Dozens of them. Low hums, not loud, not urgent, but full and overlapping, rising and falling like breath. Margaret didn't move. The air inside the shelter grew thick with it. It didn't feel like noise. It felt like presence. A kind of shared pulse. A rhythm older than language, older than names. The creature beside her placed a hand against its own chest. Its massive fingers spread across the fur just beneath the collarbone, right where the heart would be. Its eyes met hers, and without knowing why, without questioning, Margaret lifted her own hand and pressed it against her chest. Then the creature placed its other hand, slow, deliberate, on the ground between them. Margaret mirrored it. Her palm touched the earth, chest, ground, stillness. Outside, the forest hummed, and then from the edge of the trees, shapes emerged. Not loud, not fast, just silhouettes in the darkness. They didn't step into the shelter. They didn't come close. They stood among the trees, their bodies barely outlined by the moonlight pushing through the canopy. Each one raised a hand to their chest, then to the ground. In unison, Margaret couldn't breathe. Not from fear, from understanding. There was no language, no need for one. This was ritual, a vow, not of words, but of presence, of memory, of recognition. And in that moment, Margaret felt it, that she was not outside their world anymore, that whatever line had been drawn between them had shifted, not erased, not broken, but moved. She lowered her gaze. The creature's breathing had slowed, its eyes closed, not unconscious, just at rest, and the hums faded, one by one, until the forest was still again, but it wasn't the same silence as before. This one held warmth, held weight. Margaret looked down at her own hands, still stained, still shaking just a little, but no longer empty. Outside, the wind had changed direction. A breeze moved through the trees, stirring the branches gently, like fingers combing through hair, and the stars began to show through the breaks in the clouds. Margaret leaned back against the wall. Her eyes stayed on the dark shapes outside until they dissolved into the forest again, until the last glint of moonlight caught the wet fur and then disappeared. She stayed there a long time. She didn't speak again that night. She didn't need to. The air around her had shifted. The soil beneath her hands had remembered, and the hush in her chest, after all those years, no longer felt empty. It felt shared, and somewhere in that deep, wordless hum, she felt something she hadn't known she'd been waiting for. Forgiveness, not from the world, but from herself. The creature stirred in its sleep. Its hand still rested on its chest, and beside it, her own remained pressed to the ground, as if promising to stay a little longer, as if promising to listen, just a little deeper, just a little more, until the forest hummed again. The mist was still thick before dawn, curling around the trees like it didn't want to let the night go. Margaret stood on the porch, breath visible in the air, one hand cupped around a chipped mug of black coffee, the other resting against the worn frame of the screen door. Her eyes hadn't left the tree line in nearly 5 minutes. The air felt different again, charged, expectant. The kind of stillness that presses into your skin and tells you something's watching. Only this time, it wasn't fear that pulsed through her chest. It was something deeper, like the low note of a cello vibrating through the bones. Then, as the gray light pushed slowly into the forest, she saw them. They weren't hiding. Not anymore. One by one, massive figures emerged from the trees. stepping through the fog like shadows made flesh. They didn't make a sound, not a crack of twig, not a rustle of leaf, just presence, sighs, stillness. Dozens of them, a half circle of silence. Every one of them turned toward her home, her throat dried. She didn't move. She didn't blink. She simply stared, mug frozen in her hand, heart thudding somewhere behind her ribs. Then one stepped forward, older than the rest, taller, though his frame sagged with age. His fur wasn't black but silvered in long streaks, like wood bleached by years of sun and storm. His hands hung low, massive, wide-knuckled. The fingers curled like branches bent from carrying too much weight for too long. He walked slow, each step sure, deliberate, reverent, and then he stopped. At his side, the one she had cared for limped forward, no longer collapsed but upright, leaning gently on a crooked walking stick made from a hickory limb she recognized. She didn't know who had carved it. Maybe him, maybe one of the others. His leg was still bound. Her binding. He didn't look at her like before, not with fear or pain. This time his gaze was even, solemn, almost grateful. And then the old one bowed. It wasn't dramatic, just the briefest incline of the head and shoulders, as if acknowledging not just her, but something older between them. A thread, a memory. The injured one followed. So did the others. And just like that, the circle held. They weren't here to threaten. They were here to honor. Margaret's knees weakened, and she gripped the porch rail. The cold from the mug had seeped into her palm, but she hadn't noticed until now. A sharp wind tugged her shawl to one side, but she didn't fix it. Her breath was caught somewhere between disbelief and reverence. Then the young one stepped forward, smaller, wirier, still tall as a grown man. It moved without fear, without hesitation. In its hands, it carried something. It walked right up to the steps of the porch and placed it down gently, like a gift for a grave. She looked down. A braid of sweetgrass, a bundle of turkey feathers bound with a strip of soft hide, a hollowed piece of bark with seeds inside, rattling faintly in the wind. But that wasn't what stopped her heart. It was what came next. The elder reached behind him, produced something wrapped in cloth. He stepped forward again, paused halfway between the edge of the yard and the porch, and placed it on the grass. When he unwrapped it, her body stiffened. It was a carved bird, made of hickory, small, smooth, the kind of whittled shape her son used to make when he was younger. He'd given her one just like it the Christmas before the accident. She remembered it like it was yesterday, how he'd shaped it with his pocket knife, how he told her he liked the way birds never got stuck in one place. She stared at the carving on the ground. It was identical, even the notch behind the wing where he'd accidentally cut too deep. Her hand rose to her mouth. Her legs gave a little. She stepped down from the porch without realizing, eyes locked on the bird. She knelt, fingers trembling as she picked it up. It was old, weathered, not newly made. This hadn't been carved yesterday. She turned it over. On the underside, there was a faint mark, a scrape, an initial, M.H. Her initials, but not carved, burned, as if branded. She felt the breath go out of her body. They'd been watching, all those years. They'd seen her grief, seen her life unravel and fold back in on itself like a burned field. She looked up. The clan hadn't moved. Not one step, not even the elder, not even the one she'd saved. They just watched her, not demanding, just witnessing. And for the first time in what felt like a decade, Margaret began to cry. Not the kind of crying that broke open with sound and shaking. Just tears. Slow, warm, honest, sliding down her face without asking permission. She nodded. It was all she could do. She rose to her feet slowly, still holding the carved bird, and stepped back toward the porch. The elder bowed again, deeper this time. Then he turned. The rest followed. The shapes began to melt back into the woods, one by one, swallowed by fog, by trees, by distance. Only the young one lingered. It looked back once. Then it raised its hand, not high, not grand, just to chest level. It pressed its palm to its heart. Margaret did the same. Then it was gone. The yard was empty, except for the gifts and the breathless hush that settled in its wake. She turned and walked inside. The screen door whispered shut behind her. She placed the bird on the mantel, next to the photo of her son. She didn't speak, didn't pray. She didn't need to. Outside, not long after, the sound of tires crunching on wet gravel broke the stillness. A truck door slammed. Margaret wiped her face and stepped back out onto the porch just as Deputy Klein appeared around the bend. Tall, clean-shaven, hat low on his brow. He gave a short wave. "Morning, Miss Holloway," he called. "Just checking in after the storm. Heard there was some flooding down the road." She nodded. "Everything all right out here?" he asked, stepping up to the gate, eyeing the broken branches near the edge of the woods. She kept her voice even. "Nothing but wind and rain. The ridge held." He glanced toward the tree line. "Strange tracks out past Tucker's field this morning. Cows spooked. Thought maybe a bear." "Bears don't come this close," she said calmly. "No," he admitted. "But something left deep prints. Real big. You haven't seen anything out of place?" She smiled then, just barely. "No, Deputy, nothing out of place." He nodded, but not convincingly. "Well, let us know if anything happens. Some of the boys are talking traps again. I told them to hold off, but folks get nervous." She folded her arms, voice quiet. "Maybe they should be more careful where they step." Klein paused, squinted at her, then tipped his hat. "You take care now." She waited until his truck was gone before she turned back toward the house. The wind shifted. She caught a scent on the breeze. Pine, wet earth, sweetgrass, and something else, something older. She stood there a long time, the carved bird still pressed to her chest, her fingers tracing the grooves worn into its wings. And just past the edge of hearing, just as the sun broke through the clouds above the valley, she thought she heard it again. 3 soft knocks, far off, but certain. She didn't look toward the sound. She just whispered, "I know," then stepped back inside, letting the door swing shut behind her as the forest held its breath once more. The mist held low over the ridge that morning, clinging to the rocks and pine trunks like a secret not ready to lift. Margaret stepped outside with her coat unbuttoned, steam rising from the mug in her hand, not for the warmth, but for something to hold. Her fingers were stiff, not from the cold, but from the echo of the carved bird still resting on her mantle, from the weight of all that had passed beneath the trees the morning before. The ground was soft beneath her boots, the kind of damp that held prints longer than it should have, as if the earth itself didn't want to forget where they'd stood. She walked slow along the path past the shelter, her eyes tracing where the grass had been flattened, where the curve of a massive foot had pressed into the soil and left silence in its wake. There was no sound in the forest, but it didn't feel empty. It felt like something was watching without needing to look. She reached the far edge of the yard, where the pines grew in tighter and the air always smelled faintly of ironwood and old leaves. And there he was, the one she'd cared for, the one whose leg she'd stitched, whose blood she'd wiped from her palms. He stood upright now, not leaning, not broken, tall as a shed, his form barely shifting in the wind, but his eyes were on her the moment she stepped into view. Not wide, not startled, just watching, as if they'd already spoken in ways the tongue couldn't manage. She stopped a few paces from him, just outside the reach of the shadow he cast. Her heart didn't race. It beat steady, like it had finally remembered the rhythm it was supposed to keep. He didn't move, but something shifted in the air between them, like an understanding had grown its roots there and neither of them wanted to break the soil. She raised her hand, not high, not dramatic, just palm open, fingers loose. The gesture wasn't something she'd planned. It rose from her like breath, like the hum that had lived in her chest ever since that night in the shelter. And then, in response, he stepped forward. Just one step. The pine needles crunched beneath his foot. He reached his arm out, not toward her, but toward the open air between them. And he pressed his palm, slowly, into the invisible space as if he were laying it flat against an unseen window. Then, as gently as a falling leaf, he withdrew his hand and turned. She watched him walk, not limping, not hiding, just moving like something that had survived. And then he was gone, swallowed up by the trees, not in fear, but in trust. She stood there a long while after, until the sun rose high enough to burn off the mist. When she returned to the porch, she saw it, not in the yard, not on the step, but on the threshold, a braid of sweetgrass, but different than before, woven tighter, more deliberate, and threaded through its center, almost hidden, was a single strand of silver hair, her own. She knew it before she touched it. Her hand went instinctively to the back of her head, and sure enough, a small patch of hair had been clipped. Clean, precise. She should have felt fear, violation, but what she felt was something she hadn't had a word for in years. Belonging. This wasn't a warning. It was a mark, a keeping, a bond. She bent down slowly, the boards of the porch creaking under her weight, and she picked it up with both hands like a relic. The braid was warm, still held the scent of cedar smoke and crushed mint. She held it to her chest, and for a long moment, she closed her eyes. The wind rose through the valley then, not strong, but full, like the exhale of something ancient, something satisfied. That afternoon she walked the border of her land, not because she feared anything coming through, but because it felt right. She wanted to see what they had seen. She wanted to understand what it was like to guard without threatening, to watch without possessing. The sky had cleared fully by the time she returned. She made a pot of sweetgrass tea. Didn't drink it. Just let it sit on the counter, filling the cabin with its scent. And when night fell again, and the forest began to hum in its sleep, she lit a candle, placed it on the windowsill, and whispered one sentence. I won't let them hurt you. The words weren't for anyone in particular, but she knew they'd be heard. That night she dreamed of her son for the first time in years. Not the usual dream. The one with the mud and the slope and his voice calling through the rain. This time he stood at the edge of the woods. Just stood there, smiling. Not young, not old, just him. And in his hands was the same carved bird, the one she'd kept on the mantel all this time. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. When she woke, the candle had burned out. The house smelled like pine smoke in memory. And on the table, next to the cold tea, lay a single turkey feather. Clean, fresh, untouched by wind. She picked it up, turned it in her fingers. Then she smiled. Not for the past, but for the promise that came next. Because the line had been drawn now, not in fear or in secrecy, but in understanding. She was no longer just a woman on the edge of the forest. She was part of something older, quieter, a witness, a keeper. And as the morning light poured through the trees like honey spilling from a jar, she whispered the words again. I won't let them hurt you, not even realizing she'd already said them aloud. The winter was gone by the time the deer dared step into the clearing again. The trees wore green now, bright and full, heavy with the scent of life returning. Rain still came in fits and starts, but it was the warm kind. The kind that made moss swell on the stones and drew frogs back to the creeks. Margaret Holloway stood barefoot in the dirt behind her cabin, kneeling to tuck a pouch of dried comfrey and mint beneath a flat river stone beside the stump. Her fingers pressed the earth with care, like she was tucking in a child. It wasn't just a habit anymore. It was a conversation. She didn't say anything out loud. She didn't need to. The offerings had become part of her rhythm. A bundle here, a carved root there. She didn't leave them expecting a trade, but they always left something behind, too. Sometimes just bent grass. Sometimes bark with markings like finger drags. One time it was a hollow nut filled with tiny seeds that didn't belong to anything she'd ever seen grow in Georgia. But mostly, it was breath. It was presence. It was the knowing that someone still walked near her cabin, unseen but never absent. That morning, when she opened the screen door, there was something new on the step. Not placed on the porch like the others. This one leaned upright against the rail, almost casual. A thin strip of hickory bark, about 6 inches long, carved with shallow grooves, 4 parallel lines, then a space, then 4 more. At first, she thought it was just decorative, but the spacing felt intentional, the rhythm of it. It didn't look like art, it looked like memory. She ran her fingers across the markings, slowly, like reading Braille in a language only the heart knew. Then she noticed something, the number of grooves, 8. She thought of breath, the rise and fall of chests. Inhale, exhale. Not once. Repeated. It was cadence, like a lullaby without melody. And she knew. This wasn't just a message. It was how they remembered her. Not with words, with rhythm, with the shape of a life traced in wood and grass and silence. She brought it inside and placed it beside the carved bird. That night, she sat on the porch as the sun dropped behind the hills, a kettle of tea warming beside her, and watched the woods settle in. The air was thick with crickets and the low creak of trees shifting under their own weight. Somewhere in the distance, a barred owl called out, and the answering silence felt dense enough to touch. The next morning she woke to the soft clatter of something on the porch. Not a knock, not the sharp alert of warning, just a gentle bump, like someone had left something and walked away. She opened the door, and her breath caught. A single wildflower, spring beauty, delicate pale, still damp with dew, placed on the wooden step like a blessing. No footprints, no sounds, just the flower. She picked it up, cradled it in her palm, and felt the sting behind her eyes return, the kind that didn't demand tears, just silence and reverence. She didn't press it in a book. She let it rest in a shallow dish of water on the windowsill, petals wide like it was still breathing. Later that week, Deputy Klein returned. He parked farther out this time, walked up without his usual knock, hat in hand, face drawn. "Afternoon, Miss Holloway," he said, voice low. She nodded. "Deputy." He looked toward the woods, then back at her. "We've had more complaints." She waited. "Livestock, scattered fences. Some folks say something's been watching the goats. No real damage, but folks are scared." She said nothing. Klein shifted. "I told them it was probably a black bear. It's the season. They're waking up." She nodded again. "Could be?" He hesitated. Looked past her, into the open cabin, where the light from the stove flickered against the wood. Then his eyes landed on the carved bird. "You still keep that?" "Always." He looked like he wanted to ask more, but didn't. Just rubbed the back of his neck. "They're talking traps again, snares, tripwires. I told them that wasn't smart, but they're not listening much anymore." Her jaw tightened. "Traps hurt more than what they catch." "I know." She stepped down from the porch then, stood close enough that he dropped his gaze. Her voice was steady. "Let them know they're not protecting anything by lashing out at shadows." Klein studied her. "You saying you've seen something?" She didn't blink. "I'm saying not everything in the woods is meant to be feared." His mouth worked like he wanted to reply, but instead he sighed. "I'll do what I can." Before he turned, she added, "Use bells. On the fences, loud ones. Hang them low. The sound's enough to turn things away without harm." He looked back at her. "Why would that work?" She looked out toward the trees. "Because sound carries meaning." He left without another word. That evening she walked the yard in circles. Not pacing, patrolling. Her own quiet loop of care. When she came back to the porch, there was nothing waiting. But that night she didn't sleep well. She woke around 2, heart beating fast, unsure why. No sound, no light, just a weight in her chest like she'd been yanked out of something unfinished. She sat up, bare feet on the floor, and listened. Nothing. No wind, no crickets, too still. Then, faint and low, came the sound. Footsteps, not fast, not loud, but heavy, measured, and not close, just at the edge of knowing. She moved to the window. The woods were dark, but the stars were out, just enough to catch the edge of the trees. She saw nothing. Then she heard it. Not the steps, Something softer. A chime. 1, 2. Metal on metal. Then silence. Then again, another chime. From a different direction, she exhaled. The bells. Someone, or something, had brushed them. But the sound didn't feel like warning. It felt like acknowledgement, like someone had seen the trap and passed it by. She stood there for a long while, the carved bird warm in her hand, the hickory bark still sitting on the table beside her. She didn't light the lantern, didn't open the door. She just waited until the chimes stopped and the forest breathed again. The next morning, nothing was out of place. No marks, no feathers, no gifts. But she knew they'd come, knew they were still walking the line between their world and hers. And more than anything, she knew the time would come when that line would be tested. When someone, maybe Klein, maybe a rancher, maybe someone worse, would cross it, and she would have to choose. To speak, to stand. But for now, spring held. The deer came closer. The wildflowers opened earlier, and the chimes stayed silent, waiting. The heat had come in steady this year. Not sudden like in other summers, but slow and sure. The kind that crept up the spine of the valley and settled into the bones of the land like it had a right to stay. Cicadas sang long before noon. Dust rose soft behind truck tires. Even the creek had lowered, exposing round stones like skulls under thin skin. Margaret Holloway sat on the porch, wide-brimmed hat shading her face, the old rocking chair beneath her hips creaking like it was breathing with her. She'd mended the fence 3 times already that month, not because the wire was weak, but because the heat had made the wood dry and brittle. The earth was shrinking back from itself, cracking in the field edges, curling under her boots. But the woods were alive. Out past the garden, past the cedar that had split in the last storm, the tree line pulsed with sound and scent. It wasn't just birds anymore. It wasn't just deer. Something deeper moved in the shadows now. Something she knew. Something that had known her. She felt it most in the mornings, when the sun came over the ridge low and red, and the light hit the bark in a way that made it shimmer like fur. The rituals had grown quieter between them, but not weaker. She still left the sweetgrass in braids, still tucked herbs into the hollow where the old oak split. And sometimes, in return, she'd find stones placed in patterns, or small carvings, or nothing at all except the sense that she wasn't alone when she boiled her tea. But the neighbors hadn't stopped asking questions, and the men hadn't stopped talking traps. That week, she walked down to the corner store, first time in months, and found a flyer stapled to the old corkboard beside the register. Predator Watch, protect your stock. Beneath it, a list of dates, meetings, names she recognized. Some she didn't. They were bringing in hunters, not from around here. Men who'd never smelled this forest wet with July, never learned the shape of these hills through their boots. She stood in front of the flyer until her hands balled into fists. She didn't rip it down, didn't say a word, just left her change on the counter and walked out with the same quiet fury she used to carry in the surgical tent when they handed her a body already half gone. The next morning she walked the line, out past the fence, past the creek, into the wood where her voice had never echoed. She didn't call out. She didn't need to. She just stood in the clearing where they'd hummed before, where hands had touched chests, where breath had been shared in silence. And she said the only thing she could. I tried, but they're coming. The breeze moved. Not fast, not loud, but there. She waited. She waited until the sun hit the backs of her arms, until the skin there prickled, until the heat made her shoulders ache from stillness. Then she left. That night she lit a candle on the porch, not because she feared the dark, because it was a sign, a warning, or maybe just a promise. By week's end, 2 hunters had arrived, hired out of Dahlonega. Didn't ask permission, just walked fence lines like they belonged there, knocked on doors with smiles that didn't touch their eyes. Margaret watched them from the corner of her porch, a shawl across her knees, a dish of sliced peaches sweating in her lap. They didn't notice her, didn't think to ask the woman on the hill what she'd seen. They didn't last long. The first night they pitched a tent near the fire break just west of her property line. She heard the snaps of laughter, the clink of beer bottles. Then, sometime near 2 a.m., the forest went quiet. Too quiet. The next morning, their truck was still there. Doors wide open, no sign of struggle. Just gone. People whispered. They always did. Some said bear, some said they just skipped out when the job got dull. Margaret said nothing, just pulled the shawl tighter and placed another strand of sage on the coals. Then one morning she found something new. On the railing of her porch, carefully looped around a nail, was a thin strip of sweetgrass. Fresh, green, but threaded this time with silver. Not just her own. 3 strands. Braided tight. One was hers. One was fur. And the third, a thin strip of red cloth, frayed at one end, old. The same kind of cotton she used to stitch into her son's jacket back before the accident. She touched it but didn't untie it. She knew what it meant. They remembered. Not just her. Him. What was lost. What had been buried. And what still stood here, watching over the land that swallowed the living and made them part of its song. That evening, Margaret walked the field line and hammered in new posts. She didn't set traps. She hung bells, rusty soup cans, forks strung on twine, bits of copper and tin that sang when brushed. Not to scare, to speak. And just before dusk, she stepped out onto the porch one last time, the carved bird clutched in her hand, and sat facing the forest. She placed her palm to her chest, lowered it to the floorboards. Then she waited. And in the trees beyond the fence line, where the shadows moved slower than wind, 2 tall figures stepped out from the pines. They didn't come closer, didn't need to. They raised their hands, pressed them to their hearts, and bowed. She didn't cry. She only breathed, and said, so soft it didn't need volume to carry, "Michael, I've learned how to heal." The light on the porch guttered as the candle burned low. And for a moment, the wind shifted up the hill like an exhale through the throat of the world itself. Then the figures were gone. But the silence they left behind was not empty. It was full. And somewhere in that stillness, in the dry whisper of pine needles and the distant hum of cicadas settling for the night, Margaret Holloway sat with the weight of memory in her lap, and the gift of knowing she was no longer just mourning. She was guarding. She was part of the circle now. And as the last of the wax melted down the side of the flame's glass, and the dark pressed soft against the edge of the porch, a chime sounded near the edge of the field. Not a warning, not a goodbye, just a breath. Just the forest remembering her name, and answering back, like it always had. Some stories are never told with thunder. They unfold in the hush between footsteps, in the soft bending of wild grass, in the way a hand finds silence more truthful than a word. This was a story like that, of unseen paths walked not by strangers, but by souls searching for something they never knew they'd recognize until it stood in front of them. A story of what happens when grief doesn't disappear but reshapes itself into something that grows roots instead of walls. In a world that often fears what it doesn't understand, this was a reminder. Not all things hidden are meant to be hunted, and not all things different are dangerous. Sometimes the unknown is not a threat, but a reflection. Sometimes what seems wild is simply something sacred, moving in rhythms older than language, offering not answers, but presence. Healing does not always arrive with light. Sometimes it walks quietly through the shadows. Sometimes it speaks in gifts left on doorsteps. Sometimes it comes only when we've stopped asking for it and started listening instead. To the wind, to the earth, to the quiet within us that still remembers how to kneel. To witness is a form of love. To protect is an act of courage. But to belong, to be remembered not for your usefulness but for your mercy, that is where the human spirit meets something much older and far more enduring than itself. If there's anything to carry forward from this story, let it be this. Kindness echoes farther than we think. A single act of compassion, no matter how small or quiet, can ripple through places we'll never see, through lives we'll never meet. Because sometimes being seen in your silence is everything. Thank you for listening to this journey. One not just about survival, but about grace, memory, and the invisible threads that connect us. If this story moved you in any way, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Feel free to leave a comment, share your feelings, or tell us what part stayed with you. And if you'd like more stories like this, deep, soulful, and grounded in the wilderness of the heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the bell so you won't miss what's to come. Until next time, stay kind, stay open, and keep listening to what the forest is trying to tell you.